Allusion. Allusion is an uncited but recognizable reference to something else. Usually it's going to be a reference to something else in literature. Authors use allusions to make their own text richer. When an author uses an allusion, it gives their own writing the same significance or context that the allusion had. Let's look at some examples. Martin Luther King Jr. started his I Have a Dream speech by saying 50 years ago. This is a clear allusion to President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Lincoln started with 47 years ago. So, even though Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't saying the exact same thing, he started out with 50 years ago, which is similar enough that people knew he was alluding to President Lincoln's speech. This reminded people of the significance of the event. And in reminding people of the significance of the Gettysburg Address, it lent significance to the speech that Martin Luther King was making. Let's look at some other examples. Scrooge. If someone is alluded to as Scrooge, or there's a Scrooge reference in writing, it's going to be someone who is not very generous. They're kind of miserly. They don't like to share. And that would be something that you would have seen in A Christmas Carol, where he goes around and sees what his life would be like if he weren't there and realizes to change his ways. But Scrooge was a very miserly man who didn't want to share with people who really needed it. If you see Pinocchio, it's a reference to someone who is lying. If you see a Trojan horse, it means someone who, or something that is a trick. It looks like the real thing, but really there's a trap concealed inside. An Achilles heel is a reference to Achilles from Greek mythology, and his heel was his one weak spot. So your Achilles heel would be your weak spot, where someone could really get to you. A Romeo from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo would be someone who was really good with women, someone who really loved to, take girls out on dates and was really good at, getting girls to go out on dates with them. Turn the other cheek is a biblical reference when Jesus told people that they shouldn't seek revenge but should instead turn the other cheek if they're slapped once. Turn the other cheek so you can get hit on the other side of your face. And it's just his metaphor for saying, don't seek revenge. That's not the Christian way. Solomon is another biblical reference. He was a very wise king. So if you're referred to as someone who's like Solomon, it means you've got a lot of wisdom. And a good Samaritan is another biblical reference, and it refers to the good Samaritan on the road who helped someone when no one else would. So a good Samaritan today is someone who helps people or helps a person that no one else is trying to help. So allusions can be used to ground text in a particular time or place, or they can use a cultural reference to make readers feel included. There are lots of reasons that a writer would use allusions, but every time that you use an allusion, it's meant to make your text richer and give your text more than it had before. So when you're reading, watch for allusions. And if you see one of these references, say to yourself, oh, that's an allusion. I learned about those. It's here to make the text richer. And think to yourself, what connotations do you get? How do you feel differently reading that word in the text? What did that word or reference do for your interpretation of the text? Because really, that's what allusion is there for. It's to add to the text and make it better.
An overgeneralization is a type of logical fallacy, which is a failure of reasoning. And so that is what an overgeneralization is, a failure of reasoning. But more specifically, we could define it as when an author makes a claim that is so broad it cannot be proved or disproved. So when an author uses an overgeneralization, it's usually to accomplish one of two motives. The first is to create an illusion of authority. So the author may want to make it look like they have authority when in fact they do not. The second possible motive is to sway the opinion of the reader. Usually, this would be accomplished by using sensational language. And so if the author was writing a persuasive essay, he may employ the use of overgeneralization to sway the opinion of the reader. Now, take a look at this example right here of overgeneralization. Everybody knows she is a terrible teacher. Now here, the author makes an assumption that cannot really be believed. It may be that most people do indeed have a negative view of the teacher, but to say that everybody feels that way is an exaggeration. Here, the author is claiming consensus when none actually exist. Now, when a reader spots an overgeneralization like this one, they should become skeptical about the argument that is being made, because an author will often try to hide a weak or unsupported assertion behind authoritative language. So if you see a statement like this and you can recognize it as an overgeneralization, know that that means that the author is probably trying to hide a weak or unsupported assertion behind authoritative language.
Theme. Theme is the overall idea of a piece of literature. So think about the lesson or moral of the story that the author is trying to get across to you. One thing to remember is do not confuse theme with plot. Plot is what the characters do. It's the action of the story. It does not have to do with the overall lesson or message that the author is getting across. Now, obviously, what the characters do is going to help you understand the theme, but plot and theme are not the same thing. Plot is going to be more about human nature, society, and life in general. There can also be more than one theme. The author may have one overall message, but there may be a few messages in there, or you may be able to find more than one theme besides the main controlling theme of the story. Some questions to ask yourself are, what is the lesson or message? And some common themes are, man struggles against society, man struggles against nature, overcoming adversity, the importance of family and friendship, man struggles with faith, sacrifices bring rewards, and honesty is the best policy. So for all of these, I want us to look at the story of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. And this shows you that there can definitely be more than one theme for one story. Now, all of these may not be what Aesop had in mind when he was coming up with this fable, but I was able to see all of these themes in the story. The last one, I couldn't come up with something for, but I've got a good one for that as well. So, man struggles against society. You've got this tortoise who feels like he's going to keep going and he's going to try to win the race, but all of society is against him and saying, oh, that hare has got you beat. He's way faster than you. I don't know why you think you're fast enough to beat him. So I'm sure that tortoise was struggling against society's views of him. Another one would be man struggle against nature. The tortoise is struggling against the nature of his self, how he's made. He's obviously not going to be as fast as the hare. He's going to have to go up hills. He's going to be fighting against the very nature of his self, where the hare is made to go much faster. Overcoming adversity. Just simply winning the race, the tortoise ended up winning even though no one expected him to do it. Even though people were probably telling him, oh, you can't do that. The hare's always going to beat you. The importance of family and friendship. Now, I've talked a lot about society, telling the tortoise he couldn't do this, but I'd like to think that the tortoise had some family and friends on his side that were urging him on, that helped him feel like he could actually go through and win this race. Man struggles with faith. The tortoise had to have faith in himself. The hare was very, very cocky. He felt like he had this race won, so much so that he went and took a nap, where the tortoise didn't do that. He had faith in himself and knew that he could do this if he just kept going, if he gave it his all. And then sacrifices bring rewards. The tortoise sacrificed that nap that the hare took, and in the end he won the race because he just kept going. Now, the moral of the story they give you is slow and steady wins the race, but I can see all of these themes in that story. Now, honesty is the best policy. I couldn't really come up with one for, but you can always look at Pinocchio. Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew. It was not a good thing. Every time he lied, something bad happened to him. I won't ruin the whole story for you, but everyone knows about the growing nose, which is a sad punishment for someone who is not using honesty. So it's showing you honesty is the best policy. So whenever you're reading a story, you can look at what the characters are doing to figure out what the plot is, but remember the theme is different. The theme is going to be the controlling idea in that piece of literature. And you want to ask yourself, what is the lesson or moral the author is trying to get across to me?
Characters are an essential part of every story. So characters can be classified into two main categories, flat and round. The terms flat and round pertain to how much the character changes throughout the story. So flat characters have little change in personality throughout the story, or many times no change in personality. They're very predictable. They're always the same. And because they're predictable, they can be considered not very interesting. So that's why they play small roles in the story. The main characters of a story are never going to be flat characters. Instead, they're going to be round characters, because round characters incur lots of change throughout the course of a story. So they play the main roles. So flat characters and round characters both contribute a lot to a story. Obviously, round characters are needed to play the main roles because they're going to be developing and changing a lot, and that's what moves the plot along. The plot is moved along by changes in characters' personalities. Flat characters are also needed, however, because they play the smaller roles in the story, the supporting roles that make the main characters very interesting. So when we're talking about round characters, you probably heard me use the word development. And that's what authors try to do with round characters. They try to develop the characters, and it's the development of the characters that moves the plot along. If the characters stay the same, throughout the entire story, then the plot's not very interesting because the plot's not going to progress very much. So round characters are essential to moving the plot along. But the important thing to take away from this, if you remember one thing, is that characters can be split up into flat characters and round characters. Flat characters having the same personality and round characters changing in personality throughout the story.
Inference. Inferences are conclusions that a reader makes using clues in the text. So an author may not explicitly say something, but they leave little hints behind, and you have to connect the dots to form a conclusion. And inference is different than making a guess because it is based on evidence. So you read, you pick up on those clues or hints that the author leaves behind, and you put them all together to form your inference. So let's look at a couple of examples. Charlotte's toddler is in bed asleep upstairs. She hears a loud thump and then loud crying. So knowing that the toddler is in bed asleep and then hearing a thump and crying, you can infer, or Charlotte can infer when she's at home, that her toddler fell out of bed. Now, our example doesn't say the toddler fell out of bed, and it doesn't say Charlotte ran upstairs and found her child on the floor, But because you know the kid was in a bed sleeping, and then you hear a thump, probably against the floor, and then crying because the kid is hurt or scared from waking up in the middle of the night on the floor unexpectedly, Charlotte can infer that her toddler fell out of bed. Or the reader can infer that that's what happened whenever they're trying to process the story and figure out what the author was trying to tell them with these clues. So let's look at another example. Nolan sees cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth. So cookie crumbs on the floor, chocolate around his mouth is going to tell you that Nolan's son got into the cookie jar. And it may not be the cookie jar, it may be that he got into a pack of cookies, but you don't really know the rest of that. You just know that if there are cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth, that the kid got into cookies somehow. So you can infer he got into a cookie jar or a pack of cookies without the authors explicitly saying that to you. And that's all it is. That's all inference is. Reading something and coming to a conclusion. A lot of the times it's really obvious things. If you see a lady come into a store and she's dripping wet and it's raining outside, you can infer that she doesn't have an umbrella. So some things are just common sense. They come to you. You don't even realize you're making an inference. But in the end, an inference is just a conclusion that a reader makes based on evidence. Point of view. The point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. And the narrator is the person who tells the story. So when we're looking for point of view, we're looking to see if we have a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator that's telling us the story. In first person, your narrator is going to be your main character, and they're going to be saying I, me, we. These are the pronouns you're going to see associated with the first-person narrator. If it's the main character, you're only going to get to know what the main character knows. You're only going to get to read about what that main character does or what he does with someone else. But you won't know about anything that doesn't happen involving the main character because this is written from a first-person point of view and you're only going to hear from this viewpoint. Third person is the most common point of view. And you're going to see pronouns like he, she, and they. The narrator is going to talk about other characters, but the narrator is not one of the characters. And third person omniscient is very common as well. Omniscient means all-knowing. So a third person omniscient narrator is going to be one who describes all other characters. So, at once. So this narrator is going to be able to tell you what every other character in the story is thinking, what every other character in the story is doing. Now they may not actually do it all in the same passage. Sometimes they split it into chapters. So one chapter is written to where the author is telling you everything that Johnny does. One chapter is split to tell you everything that Susie does. So you find out everyone's point of view, but possibly at different times. But the author is able to do all that without actually being a part of the story. So whenever you're looking for who your narrator is, the pronouns are the important thing to look at. Let's look at this passage. John walked to school every day. He and his friends were often cold and tired by the time they arrived. They were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. In this passage, let's look at the pronouns to help determine the point of view. And your pronouns are going to be words that take the place of nouns, such as I, me, we, he, she, they, it, you. But these are going to be the ones that are really going to set you off as markers to let you know if it's a first person or third person narrator that you're listening to. So looking through this, we have he and his friends. By the time they arrived, they were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. And it started with John. So the narrator is using he and they, and someone's name. Now, first person could use someone's name, and that's why it's important to look at the pronouns. But the narrator starts talking about John, and then he uses all of these third-person pronouns. The narrator is a third-person narrator here. Oh, let's write it out. Third person. And you know this because you're looking at the pronouns. And the pronouns are all telling you that the narrator is telling you what's happening, but the narrator is not a part of the action. So the point of view is a third person point of view. So whenever you're going to find point of view, you want to know this because the perspective of the story, who it's coming from, is important. If it's coming from a certain character, or if it's coming from a first person or a third person point of view, then you're going to have a different plot or have information, more intimate information in first person and a greater variety of information with third person. So it's always important to determine your point of view whenever you are reading a story. So just keep in mind that the best way to find that is by looking at the pronouns. I, me, and we, he, she, and they. Historical context. Historical context can impact literature in a number of ways. The author's writing can be impacted by the historical period during which it was written, or the historical setting of the story. For instance, when Charles Dickens was writing, he was writing during a period where authors were paid by the word, which meant that his novels were very, very long. And that was the result of the time period during which his work was written. He was writing long novels because he knew he would get paid more for every word that he wrote. Dialect is something else you can pay attention to. The dialect could be what the author is used to using in his everyday life, or the dialect could be more related to the historical setting of the story. So dialect is something you want to pay attention to and ask yourself, is this the dialect used during the setting, or is this more of just the author using his own personal dialect that he's used to? Another thing to pay attention to with historical setting is major events that are going on. You want to be familiar with the time period during which a story is set so you can have a better understanding of it. So, one example is the Civil War. During the Civil War, slavery was the normal thing in the South. And whenever the Civil War is over, lots of slaves, or people that used to be slaves, wanted to tell their story. And so what came about were slave narratives. And these painted a picture of what slave life was actually like during that time. It was an actual account from that time period. And it kind of also told the relationship between slaves and slaveholders. So that source of writing is very valuable, and it's become one of the most important literary genres for African American writers. Today, people may still write from that perspective in that time period, but the actual slave narratives that gave first-hand accounts were very important. Another thing to pay attention to with Civil War writing, slave narratives, anything from that time period are the themes. A lot of times you'll see themes of power, race, inequality. Because when slavery ended, it was because people were saying, your skin color doesn't make you more or less of a person or a better or worse person. Everyone's equal. And while equal rights didn't come about till later, it started that theme of equality around the Civil War time. Another major event that's common is World War II. There are countless novels based around World War II events, whether it's based in Nazi Germany, whether it's based in America, as people are dealing with what was going on here. But one of the biggest things that you'll see is the topic of genocide, destroying a whole race. So your Jewish Nazi relations, you're going to see a lot of. Anne Frank, very, very popular book, one that most people are going to know about, was based on this. And if you know the World War II era, then you know what to expect when you're reading. You know that the Nazis are trying to take over most of Europe. You know that the Jews are being persecuted, and you've already got that bit of background knowledge before you even read the rest of the book. And with World War II novels, you're again going to see themes of race, power, and democracy, because in the end, people were going to say that having a government where some totalitarian dictator took over everything wasn't the best way to be. And you're going to see people highlighting the pros of democracy. So whenever you're reading, really pay attention to the historical context of the story, because the historical period during which it was written is always going to have an impact, and the historical setting is going to be very important for you to understand, so that you can understand why the author gave the character certain motivations and why the author carried out the plot as they did.
Readers must always be conscious of the difference between a fact and an opinion. So first we need to define what a fact and what an opinion is. So a fact can be proved or disproved. In other words, a fact can be subjected to analysis. However, an opinion cannot be subjected to an analysis. An opinion may not be alterable by research, because an opinion is just the author's personal feelings. So this sentence right here says the distance from New York to Boston is about 200 miles. So this right here is a fact, because this can be proven or disproven. Now, although this isn't very specific because it uses the word about, it still is a fact. You could look at a map and see that the distance from New York to Boston is about 200 miles. Now, the sentence New York is too crowded is stated almost like a fact, but it is still an opinion, because there is no objective way to measure overcrowding. And so many times an opinion will be indicated by words like believe, think, or feel. Now, in this case, New York is too crowded. We don't see any of those words, so it's stated like a fact. But you have to, as a reader, have to evaluate this sentence and realize that this cannot be proved or disproved. You have to realize that it's just the author's personal feelings. Now, many times, an opinion will be supported by facts. So an example would be the author gives the population density of New York as a reason for why it is overcrowded. And now an opinion supported by facts tends to be more convincing. However, that doesn't make it a fact, even though the writer might back it up with a fact. It's still an opinion. It's still the author's personal feelings. Now, like I said, an opinion supported by a fact tends to be more convincing. But when authors support their opinions with other opinions, the reader is unlikely to be moved. False dichotomy is an example of a logical fallacy, which is a failure of reasoning. And that's just what false dichotomy is, a failure of reasoning. But more specifically, we can define false dichotomy as when the author creates an artificial sense that there are only two possible alternatives in a situation. And by doing that, the author limits both the reader's options and imagination. And so this fallacy is common when the author has an agenda and wants to give the impression that their view is the only sensible one. And so readers should always be suspicious of the false dichotomy. When an author limits alternatives, the reader must ask, is the author being valid? Now, an example of false dichotomy is, you need to go to the party with me, otherwise you'll just be bored at home. And so here, the speaker suggests that the only other possibility besides being at the party is being bored at home. This is not true, as it is perfectly possible to be entertained at home, or even to go somewhere other than the party. And so this is an example of false dichotomy, because here the author is creating that artificial sense that there are only two possible alternatives. One is to go to the party, and one is to be bored at home. And remember that I said the author wants to give the impression that their view is the only sensible one. And so here, the only sensible option looks like to go to the party, because who wants to be bored at home? Whereas really, there's many options, and there's many sensible options in this situation. So that's why this is an example of false dichotomy. Every piece of writing should have a logical conclusion, and it's your job as the reader to identify that conclusion, mainly for the purpose of helping you to understand whether you agree with the writer or not. Because you don't want to just read a piece of literature, you want to analyze it. So one step in that process to better understanding it is identifying the conclusion to know whether you agree with the writer or not. So now I want to talk about how to identify that conclusion. So you're going to need to infer a lot, or make an inference. And to infer something just means to take what you already know and combine it with something else to draw a conclusion. So it's pretty self-explanatory. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to combine two things. What you already know with the info or the information found in the text. So I'm going to draw a double arrow there, because to make an inference, you're pulling these two things together, everything you find in the text, any pre-knowledge you have, and you're pulling that together to draw the conclusion. And generally, a conclusion should be obvious. If a writer does a good job in their writing, then the conclusion should be easily identifiable. Otherwise, you may draw a conclusion that is not the conclusion the writer had in mind. But nevertheless, it's important that you as the reader analyze the writing and identify the logical conclusion. The narrator plays an important role in the story, and it's important that you as a reader understand the narrator. So a narrator can talk in first person or in third person. In first person, the narrator will use pronouns like I and me, because they're talking about things they're experiencing and things they see happening. And in this case, the narrator will actually be a character in the story, so it's important to understand which character they are playing. In third person, the pronouns he and she are used, because the narrator is looking onto the situation, saying he did this or she did this, and so they're not a character in the story. So that's one thing you need to understand about the narrator. The second thing is how much does the narrator know? And you may be wondering why this is important. But some narrators are going to know what all the characters' thoughts are, and some narrators do not know that. And some narrators will be able to explain to the reader what's going on and their thoughts about it, and some narrators will just let the plot speak for itself. So how much the narrator knows influences how much the reader will know, because however much the narrator knows, they will then tell the reader that. So it's important to understand how much the narrator actually knows.
Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, But by seeing green feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you could look at are synonyms. If you hear the soft and supple leather, well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green feathered bird, well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay? We were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point, because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means, and you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky unfamiliar word. Inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts with facts and details and moves to a general conclusion. So it lists different details, different examples, and moves to a general conclusion or helps you come to a certain conclusion. Now, inductive reasoning is probabilistic, which means that it's based on probability. You hear certain facts and you come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is going to have some level of probability to it. Now, these conclusions can be strong or weak, and they can be proved false. You could come up with a conclusion that doesn't actually happen. It's not something that's true. But based on the examples you were given or the facts you were given, the conclusion makes sense, even if it's not true. And that's how inductive reasoning works. So let's look at some examples. We have seen 30 white swans, therefore all swans are white. Well, based on the 30 examples that we've seen, this statement makes sense. This conclusion that we drew using inductive reasoning based on our 30 examples would make sense. But is it true? No, not all swans are white. You've got other colors. So this isn't a true thing. This is a false conclusion. But we did use inductive reasoning to get there, basing our conclusion on our examples. Let's look at the next one. Basketball players are tall. John is a basketball player. John must be tall. Well, we don't actually know John, so we're not sure about this one. It's very probable, so this one would be a stronger conclusion than our one about the white swans, but we don't know John. John could be short. John could just be really good at making goals. That doesn't mean that he is going to be a tall person. So it's probable, it's a stronger conclusion, but we don't know for sure. We just use inductive reasoning, knowing that basketball players are generally tall, and knowing that John is a basketball player, to figure out that John is probably tall. This is called bottom-up logic. We start at the bottom with our examples, and we build on those facts, details, examples to come to a conclusion. So bottom up to the top to build our conclusion. Next, let's talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a conclusion and then explains the facts, details, and examples that support it. So you start with one basic conclusion, one basic statement, and then give facts and details that can support it or that are examples of that statement. This one links premises with conclusions. So you come up with a certain premise and it's linked to your conclusion that you started with. If all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So you start with this one. All dogs are mammals. Okay. All mammals have hearts. Okay. So based on the fact that all dogs are mammals and all mammals have hearts, all dogs must have hearts. So you've got dogs are mammals and mammals have hearts, which means that dogs must have hearts since they are mammals and all mammals have hearts. This is a true conclusion, and that's because all the premises are true. So if all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So on this one, we have true, all dogs are mammals. True, all mammals have hearts. So it's true that all dogs must have hearts. And this one is a true conclusion based on deductive reasoning. Now let's look at example 2. All birds can fly. An ostrich is a bird. All ostriches can fly. So we use the fact that we know all birds can fly and an ostrich is a bird to tell us that an ostrich must be able to fly. So let's look at each of those statements. All birds can fly. Well, that one is false. There are actually about 40 different species of birds that can't fly or are called flightless birds. An ostrich is a bird. Well, that one's true. All ostriches can fly. That one is false. Ostriches are a species of flightless birds. So, since the first sentence was false, the second sentence, our conclusion ended up being false. And that may not always be the case, but whenever you don't have all your premises leading up to your conclusion true, your conclusion might not be true either. Now, we did use deductive reasoning to get there. So even though this is a false conclusion, we were basing it on the information we were given, on the conclusions that were given to us. We came up with this example of an ostrich, and it just wasn't correct. It wasn't true. So over here we had false conclusion, possibly false conclusion, true conclusion, and false conclusion. So using inductive and deductive reasoning is not going to be 100% accurate. but it is going to give you different ways to reason out information you have and try to make a conclusion based on one of these kind of logics. And deductive reasoning is also called top-down logic because you start with known conclusions and work your way to specific examples at the bottom. So you start at the top, known conclusion, work your way down to the bottom to specific examples. So whenever you are trying to figure out a problem or figure out how to connect information that you have, you can use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and just make sure that you are paying attention to whether you have facts and details to start with that you can base a conclusion on, or whether you've got broader conclusions that you're going to be coming up with examples for. And remember that they won't always be true. You might still have to go and research whether the conclusion you come up with is accurate or not. Figurative language. Figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of a word, and authors will use figurative language to enhance their writing. Some common examples of figurative language are hyperbole, simile, metaphor, and personification. So we'll discuss each of those, and I'll give you some examples for each. Hyperbole is exaggeration. People will say something and you aren't meant to take it literally. You're meant to know it's an exaggeration, but it's there just to emphasize how strongly the author is trying to convey something. For instance, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I bet some of you have probably heard that one. And 1,000,000 times, really? Probably you haven't heard whatever your parent or teacher has said they've told you 1,000,000 times. It's an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize that they've already told you this a lot more times before now. Another example would be, I had a ton of homework. You did not literally go home with 2,000 pounds of homework, but you're telling people I had a lot of homework. It was way more than the normal amount. It was a ton. It was that much homework. So that's what hyperbole is, exaggeration. Next, we've got simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. And this is very important. You have to use those words like or as, or it's not going to be a simile anymore. So, the child howled like a coyote. We see our word like. You're comparing two things in this sentence. The child howled like a coyote compares the child to a coyote using the word like. This example is letting you know that the child is loud. Its crying sounds like a howl, much like a coyote. So this figurative language is used to bring a coyote to mind to help you picture and hear in your mind how this child is screaming or crying. Next, let's look at this example. She ran as fast as lightning. Well, that's going to compare two things here, and we see the word as. So what is being compared in this sentence? She ran as fast as lightning. And usually when you have one as, you've got two. So it's comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. And that is being done by using the word as. So when you're comparing a girl to lightning, you're saying she's that fast. It went so fast you barely got to see her before she got past you or got to the finish line. So it's just letting you know she's really, really fast. So that's what simile is, comparing two things using like or as. And again, these are the important words to look for to make it actually be a simile. It could be a metaphor, which compares two things without using like or as. And that is really the big difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor does not use like or as. So let's look at some metaphor examples. She was lightning running down the track. So this sentence is very similar to this one. They're both comparing she or a girl to lightning. They're both saying this girl is really fast, but this one just says she was lightning. She was lightning running down the track. It doesn't say she ran as fast as lightning. It doesn't use like or as. It just says she was lightning. So it's a different way to use the same kind of figurative language. So that's one example of a metaphor. Let's look at this. And this is an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. "And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming." Now this one's a little trickier because it doesn't just come out and say, this was this, or this is this. Like here it said she was lightning. But it says that his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. So we're comparing his eyes to a demon's eyes, which is basically comparing him, or a man, to a demon. If his eyes are like a demon's eyes, then this man is being compared to a demon, which is to maybe say that the man is evil. It doesn't mean he's literally a demon. It means he's got some characteristic of a demon. He's maybe an evil person. So in poetry, your figurative language may not always pop out at you if it's a metaphor. A simile is pretty easy to spot because you'll see like or as. But a metaphor might be a little trickier. So just look for what two things are being compared in that sentence or that phrase of a poem. And the last piece of figurative language we're going to discuss is personification, which is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. You are personifying it. You are making it do something a person would do, even though it's not something that can do these things. And remember, inanimate objects are going to be things that are not alive. A chair, a teapot, the wind, water. Those are inanimate objects. So the example here, the water slapped the side of the boat. The water slapped. Can water actually slap like a person would slap? No, but it makes you think of the action of slapping and the sound you might hear with the slap whenever you picture this water slapping the side of the boat. And that's why they're using this particular word and personifying the water. Depending on what the story is about where this sentence appears, it could be that the water is being made as like an evil character. If someone drowns in this story, then the water would be seen as an enemy, and so it slapping the side of the boat would give it that negative feeling. Another example, the teapot shrieked. Shrieking, screaming, that loud sound, you can hear it in your head when you think about the noise a teapot makes. But a teapot isn't actually shrieking like a person would. It's simply making that noise because the air is hot enough that it's trying to get out now. Or the wind howled. Wind can't howl like a wolf would howl, but wind makes that same kind of sound sometimes, and so the author is trying to put that sound of howling in your mind when they're describing the wind. So figurative language can be a lot of different things. Hyperbole, where you're exaggerating. Simile, where you're comparing two things using like or as. Very important markers for a simile. Metaphor, where you're comparing two things without using like or as. And personification, when an object is given human qualities, whenever it's personified. And all of these techniques are used so that the words will go beyond the literal meaning of them and give you a deeper understanding of the poem or the work that you're reading. The author is trying to go beyond the words and make you really think about their meaning and put certain connotations in your head whenever you're reading.
Examining causation should help you determine the relative strength or weakness of a particular argument. So say, for example, that someone says that A caused B. And maybe it's very likely that A did indeed cause B. However, we do not know that for sure, because the only thing we know for certain is that B occurred, because we can see that B occurred. However, we don't know what caused B. So although it's likely that A caused B, there's a number of other possible factors that could have caused B. So let me give you a practical example. Someone is in a car wreck, and then a few days later, they develop neck pain. So we could say then that the car wreck caused the neck pain. So this is a very strong argument. It's very likely that the car wreck did indeed cause the neck pain. It's very common for people in car wrecks to have neck pain. However, do we know this for certain? No, because there's a number of other factors to take into account. This person who was in the car wreck is an athlete. They enjoy playing basketball. So how do we know that they didn't bump into someone else and jerk their neck a little bit? And this person also has some medical conditions that have caused them to have neck pain in the past. This person also goes to the gym a lot to work out. And so maybe they were working on some of their upper back muscles and strained their neck. So as you can see, the car wreck is the most likely cause of the neck pain, but there's a number of other potential factors that could have caused this neck pain. So let's look at this first statement here. Andy didn't want a child. Because of that, he murdered his only son. So this first statement here is true. Andy didn't want a child. But can we determine from this first sentence that because his son is dead, that Andy murdered his son? As you can see, there's a lot of weak links here. How do we know Andy's feelings about the child? Well, he didn't want a child to begin with, but now that he has a child, he may enjoy having a child around. Or even if he still doesn't want a child, does that necessarily mean that he's going to murder his son? Is that common for people who don't want a child to murder their child? No, not at all. So there's lots of weak links here. And is there any concrete evidence here that suggests that Andy is the perpetrator? So lots of weak links here, and so we can't necessarily say that A caused B here. We know that B occurred. We know that his son was murdered, but we don't know who caused that murder. The second statement says, because Andy was tortured for many years in a POW camp, he was mentally unstable. This is a much stronger argument. Now, the statement is not 100% conclusive, but there's a stronger case here for cause and effect. Andy could be genetically predisposed to psychological problems. However, one would reason that years of torture would probably cause psychological problems. It would cause mental problems. So one thing that's important to look at when looking at causation is try to determine how many other possible causes for the outcome you can think of. If you can think of many other possible causes for the outcome, the causal relationship is weak, and any resulting conclusions should be questioned. However, if few other possibilities come to mind, then the causation is somewhat strong.